Today's webinar is immigration and the idea of a Christian nation. It's interesting to note how Christianity and the traditions of Christian theology are used in arguments both for and against immigration. There's a host of difficult questions that we need to navigate as we think these things through with these traditions. Just one of which is if it is true, which it seems very clearly to be, that Christians are called to welcome the stranger, does that mean that the nations we belong to necessarily are as well? And we're really pleased that Dr. Barnabas Aspray is here, that he was able to take up our invitation to come and help us think these issues through. He is the Assistant Professor of Systematic Theology at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, writes a column at Seen and Unseen online, and hosts a podcast called Faith at the Frontiers with my old friend, Austin Stevenson. And we invited him here today, especially because of two recent publications thinking about the issues that we wanted some help in thinking through. One is an article unpacking the implications of the fact that Jesus himself was a refugee. And the other is a book that he's co-authored with David Elcott titled On the Significance of Religion and Immigration Policy. Thankfully, both of these are open access, which means they're available to you online for free. And just in a couple of minutes, I'll post links in the chat so that you're able to access both of those. How this will work today, Barnabas will speak to us for, I think, probably around 40 minutes or so. And then he has a couple of interactive moments built into his session, and then which we'll do in breakout rooms. And then once he's done with that, we will be all together for further questions and discussion. These sessions run for about 90 minutes, so we'll wrap up at 2:30 UK time. So, Barnabas, we invite you to come and get started, please.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Thank you, all of you, for being here. It's a great privilege and an honor to be able to speak to you all on this really, really important topic. Um, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah?
Yep, you're good.
Yep.
All right. Um, yeah, I'm really excited to be able to share with you some of my thoughts, some of my developing and growing thoughts in this area. I have already, as Tyler said, published one book on immigration, but I'm actually hard at work on another book. Basically, the first book was a sort of survey of the terrain. It explains how different Christians around the world are arguing for diverse immigration policies and how they are using their faith and their Christian tradition as a basis for a number of different immigration policies. And there's a few deep case studies there, a case study in Hungary and a case study in Germany. We'll have a little bit of a look at that later. But what I didn't do in that book was give my own opinion of say what I thought a immigration policy should look like as it emerges from the Christian tradition and the Christian faith. So the book I'm working on right now is a more constructive attempt to build from the ground up and say this is how I think Christians ought to be approaching the topic of immigration. This is my own view. I tried my hardest to keep my own view out of the previous book because I thought it would be a more helpful book if it was very neutrally presenting all the different views that were already out there. So, and then the article that I wrote in Modern Theology that's what I'm going to spend a good bit of time on at the beginning, actually. So I won't say anything more about that right now. Um, let me share my screen so you can see where we are. All right. Can everybody see a title screen?
Yep, that's appearing now.
Brilliant. And can you see a little sculpture image on the right?
Yep.
Does anybody know what that is? Has anybody seen that before? Feel free to write in the chat as well. No, nobody know about this. It's called Angels Unawares, and it's a sculpture that was commissioned in 2016 by Cardinal Michael Czerny, who at the time was the head of the Migrants and Refugees section of the Vatican. Um, So it was commissioned by Pope Francis, and it depicts refugees and migrants on a boat. But you'll notice that one of the migrants in the middle. Oh, that's right. Yes, somebody's no, pointed out that it's in St. Peter's Square. It's a very, very privileged position in the Vatican. There are very, very few new sculptures or statues put in that place, but Pope Francis considered it important enough to put this one there. It's called Angels Unawares. You can see that one of the statues depicted there has the wings of an angel, calling to mind that famous verse in Hebrews 13:2, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Yes, Andy Meek says there's a similar statue in Battery Park, New York. In fact, yes, there's been a few replicas of that sculpture made in a few different places now. Um, and I just wanted to start by showing you that sculpture to highlight that immigrants can be of all different cultures, all different nations. You'll see all the different statues on there are all different types of people. It's always been a topic and a theme throughout Christian history and throughout biblical history, as we'll see in a minute. So this is what I'm planning to do in this talk. I'm going to start just by outlining what seems to me the important features of the current situation with regard to immigration and with a little bit of a focus on forced migration, although my broader concern is immigration of all different kinds of immigration. We'll have a look at some of the typical Western responses to the immigration situation today. And then we're going to start laying the building blocks of a Christian approach to this, which will start by doing a deep dive into the topic that Jesus was a refugee. Probably you're all very familiar with that as a trope now, but I want to go quite deep into thinking through that. And that's what my article did. Have a little look at some of the political implications of Jesus having been a refugee. And then we're going to open it up a little bit and talk about what it would mean for a Christian nation to have an immigration policy. I mean, the first thing we need to talk about is whether such a thing as a Christian immigration policy is possible or desirable. And that's part of what this conversation is going to be about as well. So to start off with, I'm sure that all of you who are here are interested in immigration already, which is why you're here. But just to get everybody up to speed and on board, I want to lay out some of the basic statistics that we're looking at. As I talk, please feel free to type your questions in the chat. I welcome questions. I don't mind being interrupted. I think that interaction is the best way that everybody learns together. I'm not here just to talk at you for as long as possible and then leave. I want us to have a conversation. I'm also willing to be corrected. I welcome debate and disagreement, and I don't have everything right, so there's things I still need to learn. And it's not fair if I don't learn anything from this talk, and you're the only ones who learn stuff. So, first of all, the current situation. The total number of international immigrants has been on the continual rise ever since people started measuring it. Now, this is not only due to the growth in the population, although, of course, the global population growth is part of the reason for this, but it's also, let me just move this. Um, it's also just the fact that migration has been going up even relative to the global population in the last 30 or 40 years. The number of international immigrants is now over 300 million, which is not a huge proportion of the total global population, but the fact that it's growing is significant. And also, there are various nations which are more affected than others. So we can have a look at the share of the population born in another country. Some of the more familiar Western units here. Germany seems to have almost 20% of the population of Germany were born in another country. The UK is a little bit below that, the US a little bit below that too, and Europe just at about 12 or 13% of people who are immigrants in a different country. But you can see all of those statistics, all of those lines are going up. So immigration is continuing to grow in all of these different countries. I should say, though, we are often very, very focused on the West, especially if we live in the West. I guess there's some excuse for that, but it's worth comparing the situation to situations elsewhere in the world just to get a bit more of a sense of whether our situation is particularly unique. Uh, are these Western nations particularly sort of experiencing particularly high levels of immigration compared to other nations? Not if you look at some of the top immigration nations in the world. Have a look at this. Um, Countries in the world with the largest immigrant populations are looking at completely off the scale different levels of immigration to any of the countries we just looked at. So there's often a sense in the West that immigration is this huge problem or concern because tons of people are coming to the West and we need to figure out what to do with the problem of mass migration and all this kind of thing. But although there are more immigrants coming to the West than there were before, as you can see, that's not remotely the levels of migration that some other nations in the world are dealing with, and it's just worth bearing that in mind. It's not a particularly Western issue. If we look at the question of refugees in particular and of forced migration, those who are forcibly displaced, we see a similar trend. So these statistics come from UNHCR, the global trends. They're always a couple of years behind the current date, but we can see the numbers of forcibly migrated people in the world has been climbing steadily since, yeah, in the last 12 years at least. And there's no signs that this is going to start going down anytime soon. Forcible displacement, I want to focus on forcible displacement simply because that's the most traumatic and challenging form of displacement for the people who are displaced. If you're not forcibly displaced, it might still be that you've experienced some kind of trauma or that there's some kind of uh, unhappy situation that is leading you to migrate. But forced displacement, by its nature, is displacement from people who had no choice but to leave their country. They often had to leave everything behind uh, due to a threat to their life or safety. Now, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on the technical definition of a refugee and the technical definition of a forced migrant here. Just want to get across the broad brushstrokes of what kind of a thing we're looking at. The number of refugees in each of the countries, let's just have a look at a quick graph of that. So we can see Germany's in the lead. Again, just looking at Western nations for now. Germany has a lot more forcibly migrated people in its country than most of the other Western nations. The US has one of the smallest proportions of refugees, and the UK, as you can see, is hardly a front runner here. But again, it's instructive to compare this chart, which makes it look as if there's a lot of refugees in these Western countries. Compare this chart with some of the non-Western nations that have the top numbers of refugees. And again, the Western nations shrink into insignificance in terms of the number of refugees that are in their countries. The Lebanon has a much more significant influx of refugees. These are some of the top refugee intake countries in the world: Chad, Jordan, Armenia, Turkey, all dealing with much higher numbers of forced migrants than any of these Western nations. Germany is the only one that comes close here, and that's for reasons that we'll talk about later. So, what are the key takeaways from some of these statistics? Well, first of all, migration will probably keep increasing, and forced migration will also probably keep increasing. There's no signs that this is a trend that is going away. And also, though, Western nations are not necessarily the most affected. I want to try and avoid certain Western centrism here. If we live in the West, if we're privileged enough to inhabit a Western nation for one reason or another, it is incumbent upon us to think about how our nations are going to deal with immigration. But one of those factors, when we want to think about how to deal with immigration, we want to not be isolationist about it, and we want to not just pretend that we're the only ones who have to think about it. We can learn things from other nations, and we can recognize that we're part of a global community that's all thinking about the problem of migration right now, if it is to be thought of as a problem, certainly an intellectual problem. But this means that how we think about migration matters and will only continue to matter. This is not one of those trendy topics that today is really relevant and tomorrow is going to be irrelevant to people. It's a topic that's going to stick around. It is worth investing the time and attention in thinking rightly about this because for the rest of our lives, we're all going to be facing uh, questions of migration. Migration is going to be in the news. It's going to be on our doorstep in various ways. And we need to make sure that we are thinking about it in the right way, which means fact checking everything, of course, but it also means asking ourselves what is a distinctively Christian way of thinking about immigration? Is there a Christian way of thinking about immigration? Some people are surprised when one starts by saying, I want to think about Christian immigration in a Christian way, or does the Bible have anything to say about immigration? I certainly know from my own story that I grew up reading the Bible a lot. I grew up in an evangelical community, but throughout my childhood, what the Bible has to say about migration never really came up. And when I first approached the topic of refugees and migration, I found myself asking, is there anything in the Bible on this topic? And I was shocked to think that I'd never actually asked this question before. But when I actually started reading the Bible with an eye to the question of migration, it suddenly astounded me how much there is in the Bible on this topic. And it made me think, how did I never see this before? It's everywhere. Almost every major figure in the Bible is a migrant. Almost all of them are actually forced migrants as well. Refugees is a very central topic in the Bible, and yet somehow I'd never noticed that before. And so I don't want to assume that we're all that it's obvious to all of us that migration is an important topic for Christians. I want to start by asking, well, is it really an important topic? The Bible does have some specific commands about how to treat immigrants, and if you're interested in this conversation, you probably already know what those commands are, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them. What I want to do is go a little bit deeper and look at what the Bible as a whole has to say about migration, even when it's not giving specific commands about migrants. But before we look at that, I just want to look at some of the typical responses from some of the Western nations to migration that claim a Christian basis for them. What are some of the things that Christians are saying in regard to immigration, Christians in the top political realm? You're probably all very familiar with the position of the uh, recently defeated Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, but he was very famous for invoking Christianity as his reason for restricting immigration. He says those arriving has been raised in another religion and represent a radically different culture. Most of them are not Christians but Muslims. This is an important question because Europe and European identity is rooted in Christianity. There is no alternative and we have no option but to defend our borders. So for Viktor Orban, the Christianity inherent in Europe was a reason to restrict immigration and to make sure that immigrants from a different religion are not allowed in. That's how we protect ourselves. We defend and protect our Christian values. That was his own way of approaching immigration from a Christian point of view. But we see similar things much more recently in Great Britain, for example, with the head of Reform UK, Nigel Farage, who, in a speech just this month, I think, says, we will make sure that it's British people who go to the top of social housing lists and not young men who have just arrived by boat. Resounding applause to this statement. And then he connects some of this immigration policy to what he calls Judeo-Christian principles. He says we can bring back the basic fundamental British values to understand what this country is, what it was built on, and to respect and to cherish the Judeo-Christian principles that made our country what it is. So for him, again, restoring Judeo-Christian principles and values to a nation that was historically known as Christian and is traditionally Christian lines up with keeping immigrants out and focusing on British citizens instead. And very famously, last year, the Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance, invoked Christianity again as a reason for focusing his priorities on, or for the US government to focus all of its priority on its own citizens and not on refugees and immigrants. He said there's this Christian concept that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. A lot of the far left has completely inverted that. They seem to hate the citizens of their own country and care more about the people outside of their own borders. That is no way to run a society. Thank God we now have an American president who's looking after the citizens of his own country. This spawned a huge online debate, which many of you may have followed, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. It was all a debate about this Christian concept called the Ordo Amoris, very deeply traditional Christian concept, and to what extent that's applicable to questions of immigration. But J.D. Vance said this as a way of justifying and validating the US government's current immigration policy, which Donald Trump is very proud of being one of the biggest deportations in the history of the US. He's very proud of having a zero tolerance policy to illegal immigrants and of employing ICE to basically deport as many migrants as they possibly can. It's not just a focus on illegal immigrants, though. That often seems like it's the focus because that's the way they talk about it. They often talk about just cracking down on illegal immigration, but there's actually a lot of moves to restrict legal immigration to the US as well. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So what the picture I want to paint with for you here with these quotes is that very often in the West, when Christianity is mentioned by politicians, it is mentioned in connection with a very restrictive immigration policy, with an immigration policy that wants to put up the walls, put up the borders, and keep people out, because the Christian thing to do is to focus on preserving our own values and our own citizens and all that kind of stuff. Now, for any of us who don't think that that is truly representative of the Christian way of thinking, we are presented with a challenge and a task. What we have to do is to go back to the Bible and develop an alternative approach to immigration that actually makes sense and is coherent. And one of the hard things about that is that in Western politics more broadly, we'll see that those on the right, those with more conservative agendas, very often have a very clear immigration policy. There's no ambiguity about what the US government is trying to do right now, and there's no ambiguity about what Nigel Farage would do if he became the Prime Minister of the UK. Whereas on the left, there's less clarity about exactly what the immigration policy would look like. And that's why we have to work harder to develop some clear boundaries and some clear lines about what we mean when we talk about a more welcoming immigration policy. The best place to start with that is the Bible, if we're Christians. And the best place to start in the Bible is with Jesus. That's not the only place we can go, but this is the place I'm going to go right now. So we're going to start by looking at the fact that Jesus was a refugee and asking some questions about it. Let's turn to that Bible verse first of all. So we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2. It says, "An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" Now, almost every Christian who's engaged with the topic of migration at any level will already be familiar with the phrase that Jesus was a refugee, or some people say the Holy Family were refugees. And it's very often invoked as a reason to be more welcoming towards migrants. But the problem with that is that the logic is often not made very explicit. It's just assumed that if Jesus was a refugee, that means you should be more welcoming and supportive towards migrants. Why? Well, because Jesus identifies more with migrants. Okay, sure. Or because you might be turning away Jesus if you turn away a migrant. Perhaps. But there's more that can be said there. And so I want to start just by going deep into this question, why was Jesus a refugee? And I'm going to offer three different answers to this question that are purely exegetical, purely at the level of understanding scripture on its own terms, before then trying to apply that to the present day. So at the moment, we're going to focus just on the Bible and on the Bible, the time of the Bible, on the message of the Bible itself. But once we've done that, we're then going to turn and look at how to apply that for today. First reason Jesus was a refugee, I want to suggest, is because the people of God are refugees. What do I mean by the people of God? Well, I mean the people chosen by God to represent him. In the Old Testament, that means the people of Israel. In the New Testament, that means the church. Why is this? Well, have a look at the end of that passage that I quoted. It said, "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son." Two things to say about this. First of all, Matthew, the author of this gospel, is invoking a prophecy as a reason for the refugee experience of Jesus and Mary and Joseph. It was to fulfill a prophecy. Now, if the refugee experience of Jesus was to fulfill a prophecy, that suggests that it was something that was ordained by God, not something that was sort of random and accidental that might or might not have happened. It was something that was meant to be part of the earthly life of Jesus, just like Jesus' own death and resurrection. Jesus came in order to do certain things, and one of those things was apparently to be a refugee. But the other funny thing about this passage is if you go and have a look at the Old Testament passage, it doesn't actually look like a prophecy. Matthew here is quoting the book of Hosea, and this is what it says in context. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to the idols." Now, this is puzzling for anybody who hasn't done a lot of biblical studies, because it doesn't look like a prophecy at all. For one thing, it's talking about the past, and for another thing, it doesn't seem to be prophesying anything about the Messiah, right? It's just recounting Israel's own history. A moment in Israel's history when Israel was called out of Egypt by God, out of slavery in Egypt, and that's all Hosea is describing. So in what sense is this a prophecy, and in what sense does Jesus need to fulfill it as a prophecy? Now, for those of you who have done a bit of biblical study, you may be familiar with the concept of the theology of recapitulation. This is based on the principle that Jesus, in his role as the Messiah, took upon himself the calling of the people of Israel in order to fulfill that calling in his own person. So, because Israel had failed to keep the covenant properly, and because they were exiled due to that failure, there was a sense in Israel that there needed to be somebody coming along who was going to succeed where Israel had failed. The role of the Messiah was to be the one true representative of Israel. But in order to represent Israel, they had to repeat some of the key moments in Israel's own history to sort of establish themselves as the one true Israelite. So, seen in this light, Hosea chapter 11 is to be read as recalling an event in prophetic mode. I mean, it is written in a prophet, and it's a mistake to think of prophecy as just predicting the future. Many prophecies in the Old Testament are not actually predicting the future, rather, they are offering a divine perspective on events past, present, or future. But in this case, Hosea is actually laying down principles about what it means to be Israel, which then everybody recognizes needed to be taken up by the Messiah in order for the Messiah to fulfill his role as God's chosen representative of Israel. So in this context, Jesus' displacement to Egypt is a reenactment of Israel's displacement from Egypt. Obviously, the direction is reversed, but it's the great Exodus event that is being reenacted. Israel's deliverance from slavery and oppression. Jesus was displaced in order to fulfill his role as the faithful representative of Israel. So, Jesus was displaced to fulfill his role in representing Israel who were also displaced. If we think the displacement of Israel is the displacement of fleeing slavery from Egypt. That is a displacement event. It's a forced displacement event because under any definition of a refugee or a forced migrant, they are somebody who is being persecuted due to their race. Israel was being persecuted in Egypt due to their race. They were slaves. So the great Exodus event in the Bible is a forced displacement event, which Jesus then recapitulated. The people of Israel as a whole had a refugee experience. Jesus was also displaced to show continuity with Abraham. What do I mean by that? Well, we go back to the very beginning of the story with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. It says, the Lord said to Abram, who was Abraham at the time, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So the first part of this is when God calls Abram to leave his own country. We can't call that a forced displacement event because Abraham was choosing to go somewhere else. And forced displacement is when you have no choice but to go somewhere else because you're being persecuted in your current place. But later on, we can see further down in verse 10, it says there was a famine in the land, and so Abram went to Egypt to sojourn there. In other words, Abram was escaping a famine, and that we could call a real forced displacement event. In other words, Abram, right from the beginning, experienced a refugee situation. Now, there's an interesting interfaith dimension to this. And the book that I wrote was co-authored with a Jewish scholar. There was meant to be an Islamic scholar involved in that book as well, although they didn't have time to complete their chapter in the end, and so they had to drop out, sadly. But one of the things that we discovered as a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim trying to write a book on migration together is that we all three Abrahamic faiths look to Abraham as their father and founder. Christianity is very clear about this in Romans 4:11 and in Deuteronomy 26:5. This means to be a member of any of those three religions is to be part of Abraham's family. And to be part of Abraham's family means to be part of the family of a migrant, unsettled, on the move. And this migrant nature of the very founder of all three of those religions is more significant than it might appear at first glance. You might think, well, that's just a matter of origins, that's just a matter of history. No, it's not just a matter of history. And this is made clear by an interesting incident that occurred in the New Testament in the book of Acts, when Stephen in Acts chapter 6 was dragged before the Sanhedrin to account for some of the things he had been saying. Stephen, of course, is the first martyr in the book of Acts. First martyr apart from Jesus himself, I guess. It's easy for us to imagine that Stephen is just being persecuted for the reasons all of the other Christians in Acts are persecuted, simply for being Christian, for talking about Jesus. But if we look more specifically at what Stephen was being accused of, it's not just being a Christian. People said, this man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law. In other words, they were accusing him due to the role of place in their self-understanding. Now, there's a really, really excellent article by Christopher Hayes, which I want to use here. Christopher Hayes wrote an article in 2021, which is published in Open Theology, so it's also open access, by the way. Really, really excellent article, which analyzes Stephen's speech that he gives to the Pharisees and Sadducees here. This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law. Stephen comes to the conclusion that the Jews have forgotten that God doesn't actually live anywhere in particular, but that God accompanies people wherever they are in the world. In other words, the Jews had forgotten the migrant nature of being Jewish with its origins in Abraham. So Christopher Hayes says Stephen opens his discourse by recalling that God's people were migrants long before they took ownership of the promised land. From the outset, he harps on the theme of being outside the land, beginning with Abraham. When God first spoke to Abraham, Stephen explains the patriarch was not in the promised land, but rather in Mesopotamia. You forgot. Oh, sorry. I did. Stephen ends by saying the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands. So there's a bit of a focus on the temple here, but the larger focus is on the role of place in what it means to be the people of God. And Stephen is trying to remind the Jews that God is not confined to a particular place, he's not localized to a particular place, that he's everywhere. And that the God's own people, the Jews, experience migration in multiple places in their history, that they don't have to be tied down to the particular land that God promised to give to them, that they need to recognize that that land is, as we'll see later, not necessarily entirely theirs, but it still belongs to God. They should never forget their migrant past, nor the way that God was present to them no matter where they were. We can see this if we look at the Old Testament law. In the book of Leviticus, God says, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers, Gerim, and sojourners, Toshavim, with me." Israel never actually owned the land. Israel was always meant to think of themselves as migrants living temporarily in this land, which really belongs to God. They were tenants of the land. The word there for strangers, Gerim, is the key word for Ger, which I discuss in my book on the significance of religion and immigration policy. Absolutely crucial word all the way through the Pentateuch, the most frequent command in the Pentateuch, apart from the command to honor the divine name, is the command that it is commands that have something to do with the stranger. You might want to say to me, though, but didn't God give this land to the Israelites? Isn't the land the promised land that God promised to give to the people of Israel? Isn't Israel all constituted by its land in one way or another? Well, yes and no. To be sure, we can say that God gave a certain land to people, but what does it mean for God to give the land to the people of Israel in the first place? So I'm going to draw here on Christopher Wright's excellent book, Old Testament Ethics for the People of God, where he looks at the meaning of the verb to give. He says this: the verb natan, normally translated to give, often has the more technical sense of assign, deed, transfer, convey when combined with the land. It was not just an arbitrary and unconditional gift, but a constituent grant that formed part of the total package of their relationship henceforth. Israel's enjoyment of the covenanted gift, therefore, demanded their reciprocal obligations to the covenanting giver. This meant that the land was still Yahweh's land. He retained the ultimate title of ownership and therefore also the ultimate right of moral authority over how it was used. Now, this is really, really important point that we have to lodge in the foundations of our minds when thinking about migration. Even in the case of God giving Israel a land, that giving was better understood as an entrusting of a land that still belonged to God. And if the land still belongs to God, then the people of Israel are still technically migrants. They're still tenants. That's what the Old Testament law very clearly says. So what are some of the key takeaways from this point? God's people must never forget their migrant past because it's part of their identity. So far, we've got we've looked at one reason that Jesus was a refugee, essentially because the people of God are refugees. And we looked at that in two different ways. First of all, the people of Israel as a whole, due to their forced displacement from Egypt, escaping slavery, which Jesus then reenacted in his own forced displacement, and due to Jesus' sign of continuity with Abraham, with seeing the whole people of Israel at every point as migrants. But there's more to be said. I want to suggest that Jesus was a refugee not only to fulfill his role as a representative of Israel, but to fulfill his role as a representative of all humanity. Jesus was a refugee because all human beings are refugees in one sense or another. What do I mean by that? Well, I want to go back to the very original creation story, the story of creation and fall, when Adam and Eve, after they had taken the fruit, were driven out of the Garden of Eden. That was a forced displacement event, a forced migration event. You see, there's a sense in which all human beings, by virtue of the fall, are not at home in the world, because this world is a fallen and broken world, and where we really belonged was the Garden of Eden, which we've been driven out of due to sin. So Israel represents all of humanity, just as Jesus represents Israel. And so Jesus also represents all humanity. And Jesus' displacement is a mirroring of the anthropological displacement of all humanity. Jesus recapitulates not only Israel's story, but Adam's story. And Adam and Eve's story is, in fact, the story of all humanity. Adam and Eve, the parents of all humankind, were exiled from Eden. And whatever is true of Adam and Eve for Christians is true of all human beings. Adam and Eve are representatives of all humanity throughout the Bible. You can see this in Romans 5, 12 to 15, for example. Adam and Eve brought the curse of death on themselves, which is why all human beings die. And therefore, if Adam and Eve are exiled, it means that all humanity is in a state of exile from the Garden of Eden. We long for the home we have never known and feel ill at ease in this world. So, Jesus experienced displacement because the people of God are refugees, but more deeply than that, because through the people of God, all humanity is refugees. And finally, because the church is called to refugeehood, the church as the uh, people of God reconstituted around Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus' refugeehood, in other words, does not only point typologically backward to Old Testament uh, predecessors or precursors, it also points forward as a model of the community that Jesus founded, the community of the church, his own body. This community shares in Jesus' own life. So whenever somebody is baptized, they are disconnected from the ancestry of the first Adam and connected instead to the ancestry of the second Adam, which is Jesus. You can see this in verses like Colossians 2 or 1 Corinthians 15:22 or Romans 5:12. When we are baptized, we die to the old self and its ways and rise again to a new self, which is empowered by the Spirit of Jesus. But in spite of this dramatic change, the status of being a refugee is not something that changes, but its referent changes. Christians are not those who are most at home in the world. On the contrary, before becoming Christians, we might have had the illusion of being at home due to being just sort of acclimatized to living in a sinful world, comes with just our habituation to worldly ways of thinking. But baptism is a sharp wake-up call, a reminder of our original created status as not belonging in this world of sin, and a conferral of our new redeemed status as citizens of heaven. Now, any of you who are fans of N.T. Wright might want to object at this point that saying our citizenship is in heaven doesn't mean we're trying to escape Earth to get to heaven. N.T. Wright is very keen on this idea that we're not trying to get to heaven away from Earth. Rather, heaven is going to colonize Earth. So when Paul said in Philippians 3:20 that our citizenship is in heaven, he didn't actually mean we need to get away from Earth. He meant that we are like colonists colonizing Earth from a heavenly point of view. We're still meant to stay on Earth. Now, I'm perfectly happy with all of that. I'm not planning on disagreeing with the great Tom Wright. All I want to point out is that when Paul says our citizenship is in heaven, it still implies that we're not entirely comfortable and home on earth. We still have a heavenly origin, a heavenly reference point of the kind of life and society that we are meant to embody. Critical to the self-understanding of the early church, not only in the New Testament, but long after. Let's first have a look at the great refugee epistle, 1 Peter. descriptor Peter uses, that sets the agenda of the entire letter. Everything else in the letter is written to exiles, to refugees. And he underscores this point later on in 1 Peter 2:11. I urge you as aliens and exiles. In modern terms, we can say Peter addresses the church as refugees. He sees the church as being fundamentally constituted by forced displacement, and he speaks to them from that place. There's a ton more I could say about how this framing of 1 Peter opens up new ways of reading, especially what comes right after 1 Peter 2, but there won't be time for that right now. What I want to show now is that this self-understanding as being aliens and exiles in the world constituted the early church long after the New Testament period. All these different other early church documents also addressed themselves to the church that was exiled. 1 Clement, to the Church of God which sojourns at Rome, I think that's actually from the Church of God which sojourns at Rome, now that I think about it. There's a slight typo there, apologies for that. To the Church of God sojourning at Corinth. Epistle of Polycarp again. To the Church of God sojourning at Philippi. Martyrdom of Polycarp. To the Holy Catholic Church of resident aliens everywhere. So there's this ubiquitous understanding in the early church that we don't belong where we are. We are resident aliens. We are refugees in this place, wherever we are. We can see this most clearly in the Epistle to Diognetus. He writes, Christians dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners, xenoi. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. What does all of this mean? Well, I'll just summarize where we've got to so far. Jesus, the founder of the church, was displaced to set an example to his followers so that we should also understand ourselves, that should read, as displaced. Let's gather these insights together and unpack their significance. First of all, I want to ward off certain potential bad ways of understanding our alien identity. There's a very interesting book here by Benjamin Dunning called Aliens and Sojourners, Self as Other in Early Christianity. He surveys all of these different tropes by which the early church sees itself as alien. And he warns against the danger that identifying as an alien can be a political strategy to make yourself look like the underdog, and thus less dangerous and threatening. But it can also be a way of immunizing yourself from critique. Oh, we don't really belong in this country. We're like aliens. We're strangers in this country. And therefore that's why we're persecuted. We have different customs to the rest of the world. And he warns that if you do that, you can sometimes make yourself invulnerable to any kind of criticism because the way you're living is just not measured by the standards of the country that you're in. And he warns against doing that. I don't want to suggest that every way of self-identifying as a foreigner for Christians is a good way of doing so. But I do want to suggest that there is a good way of doing so. First of all, self-designation of refugeehood breaks down conceptions of otherness and replaces them with a recognition of sameness. My point here is that we are all in the same boat from a Christian point of view. None of us really belongs in the country that we're in. None of us really can claim the right to ownership of the country that we're in. So if we see ourselves as aliens and strangers in the world, it helps us to see that there isn't this divide between we who are citizens and they who are foreigners, they who are migrants, they who are refugees. It helps us to see that we're all one common human family. Let me give an example of of how this might make a difference. And this is a negative example coming from two different books that are critical of an overly welcoming immigration policy. So we have James Hoffmeyer in the US writing about illegal immigration, and Nigel Biggar in the UK also writing about mass immigration and worrying about it. And both of them use the exact same term. We have a problem. The problem I'm identifying with this is that who is the we that they're talking about? The we that they're talking about is we citizens of this Western nation. The we is not we, the church, or we, the global community. The we is we wealthy white Westerners, basically. And the they is the immigrant, the illegal immigrant, or the mass migrants, or whatever. Um, I suggest that if we recognize our own identity as displaced through Adam and Eve, through Abraham, through Jesus, through many different forms, it steers us away from using this kind of language. And the Bible itself steers away from using this kind of language because it keeps reminding the people of Israel that the reason for being kind and compassionate to strangers is because of their own identity as strangers. Exodus 22 says, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." Now, most of the Old Testament laws don't have a reason given for them. Most of them are just laws, and if you break them, you're a criminal, right? But here's a law with a reason. Why should you not be unkind, mistreat resident aliens? Because you remember what it's like. And who's the you here? Not necessarily the people, the individuals who are being addressed, because people would have been reading this law who had lived their whole lives in Israel, for example. So the you who's being addressed here is you as a community who is constituted by displacement in your past, in your identity, in your history. Breaking down conceptions of selfhood and replacing them with a conception of common humanity. The other is the same as me. Now, take a deep breath. What are the political implications of some of this? Does anybody know where this flag comes from, by the way, what this flag is? No? This is the flag that was designed in 2015 as the national flag of the planned refugee nation. In 2015, there was a drive um, to create a refugee nation by setting aside an island or a portion of land in the world and allowing all refugees to go and live there and found their own nation. And this was to be the flag, which was a red-orange flag resembling the life vests of the Mediterranean refugees. Political implications. Well, we as Christians don't belong anywhere, but we can sometimes be placed in positions of authority or in positions of influence in government. So we are led to ask ourselves the question, what kind of immigration policy arises from everything that we've been talking about? But before we ask that question, can we even talk meaningfully about the idea of a Christian nation in light of everything we've said? And at this point, I'd like us to get into breakout groups, and I'd like for you to discuss this question. Tyler, are you able to put everybody in breakout groups of like 4 or 5?
We are. I
What
think
is,
John Ross is set up to do it. Sorry, carry on.
oh, okay, well, any of you. Um, what is meant by a Christian nation? What is the definition of Christian nation? And is it even a meaningful idea to talk about? Can we just have like maybe just 4 minutes talking about that?
You know.
Hello, everybody. I'd love to hear some of your fruits of your discussion if anybody's willing to share from what their group said.
I can go ahead uh, if you allow.
Yeah, go on.
Please.
Right. So we discussed that Christian nation would necessarily mean a Christ-like nation, and
Mm-hmm.
a Christ-like nation which has values and which has compassion, kindness, love for everyone, for migrants, and for everyone. And we also had a little discussion about another question that, okay, if a Christian nation is a nation like Christ, then how would have Christ himself dealt with uh, some people or migrants who had probably had some negative agendas, how would he have dealt with them? That's another second
Very
question.
important question, isn't it?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's getting to some of the nitty-gritty of the problem, right? Does a Christian nation imply open borders? Does it imply letting everybody in who wants to come in? If not, what does it imply about? So Eric says Christian nation has in the past tended to be imposed, not what the New Testament implies should happen. Thank you, Eric. Anybody from room 1 want to share your discussion?
Jacob, share what you said.
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot there, Adam. No, I said that I'm from India. Sorry, I'm just driving here. Let me just park to the left. I said I come from India, and Christians are a minority here in India. But more than that, I was saying that the word itself could be an oxymoron. I don't know whether we could have a Christian nation, the idea of a nation state that we have here. I think a Christian is one who's voluntarily given his heart to the Lordship of Christ, and they can be good Christians in a nation, and they could be Christians at the helm of politics. But can an entire nation be Christian in that sense? I think Augustine is hitting at this question when he's talking about the city of man and city of God. A nation, a city, a political entity is looking after the material and social well-being of its nation, whereas Christianity is calling for more than that. So I think in some sense they're at odds. But Adam gave a reply to that from a Judeo-Christian Western perspective, which I tend to agree with.
What's your reply, Adam? Great to see you, by the way.
Good to see you, Bunny. Just recognizing that whereas in Britain you have there is an imbrication of the state with language about Christianity, and indeed with an established church and things like that. There is some form of meaning to being able to say this is a Christian nation, even if it doesn't encompass the whole citizenry and that type of thing. So,
yeah, thank you. You guys are getting at some of the really tricky problems that we're talking about here. Does a Christian nation imply that everybody in the nation is Christian? And does it mean some kind of laws that legislate Christianity, like the law requiring everybody to go to church on a Sunday, for example? Is that what a Christian nation implies? Any other thoughts from? Have we heard from anybody in room 2 yet?
We were talking, I mean, again, mostly about the question of, is the thing possible as well?
Yes,
And,
exactly.
Yeah, and recognizing the New Testament doesn't look like it's trying to set us up. Like, it doesn't give instructions for how to be a Christian nation. It seems to give instructions for how to be Christians in other nations.
Yes. And now there may be circumstantial reasons for that, right? Because during the time the New Testament was written, the church didn't have almost any political power. And so the question of how to rule was not foremost in anybody's minds. David Blowers, you have your hand up. I'd love to hear from you.
Thought that came to me because Tyler had said that in our group, but then we were brought back into the main group before we voiced it. So I confess that I haven't had this peer reviewed at all. But is that actually one of the big distinctions between New Testament and Old Testament? Where New Testament doesn't set us up to be a Christian nation. We're to be Christians within a non-Christian setting, very often sojourners. Whereas Old Testament laws often come and say, basically, this is a law for you and the alien who is residing amongst you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just noting the distinction there.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I forgot the name of the person who brought up Augustine's City of God. I can't see that now. But thank you for bringing that up, Jacob. Because you're absolutely right. Like Augustine says, the church is the city of God, right? On earth. The church is the Christian nation. which is intertwined inextricably with various worldly and earthly nations that are passing away and belong to the old order. And so you couldn't possibly have a Christian nation in the sense of a territory owned and governed by secular rulers, because they wouldn't be the church. And yeah, Rena says imposition of Christianity has not always been a good thing in many countries. This is the tricky problem that we now have to address, right? If we think that Christianity has something to say about immigration, we have to face squarely the fact that an immigration policy implies a nation, implies a territory. And if you have a territory, is there a Christian way to govern that territory? If there is, we're talking to a certain extent about some sort of Christian nation, aren't we? Now, Sarah, please.
I was just thinking, apologies if this has already been said, but if you're talking about a Christian nation, what, the question of, okay, what does that actually mean then? Because I was thinking, well, it means living according to Christian values and so on. But given the fact that you can more or less justify anything by proof texting, it still leaves that whole question of, okay, so if, let's suppose everybody was Christian within a particular nation, how is that characterized? What are they actually doing? How are they living and so on? Because, like I say,
Absolutely.
you could have a range of politicians from Nigel Farage through to whoever who could probably come up with quite a few biblical texts to justify why they're doing what they're doing. So that's kind of my thought.
There's diverse conceptions of Christianity, right? And of what Christianity entails for national politics and national government. And of course, there has always been a contingent of people in history who thought that Christianity should have nothing to do with secular politics, complete withdrawal from society, because any involvement in secular politics always leads to a corruption and leads to, as many of you are writing on the chat, imposition of Christianity, that you're then making laws that force other people to behave as Christians, even if they're not. And is that a Christian way of doing things? But then if you want to have laws about immigration, if you want to have an immigration policy that reflects the heart of Christ, how can you do that without imposing that on everybody in the country, even those who are not Christians? So this leads naturally to the question of, well, I'm going to skip this. What is Christian nationalism? Now, I'm not going to do breakout groups again, but Christian nationalism is, of course, where this conversation naturally leads, because there's a lot of conversation about Christian nationalism right now, but it's often defined differently depending on who you're talking to. So instead of doing breakout groups again, can we just write in the chat, what's your definition? What do you understand by Christian nationalism when you hear that term used? Or have you never heard the term? I'd be interested to hear that as well. And is Christian nationalism really just the same thing as wanting a Christian nation? Or wanting your nation to behave in a Christian way? Sarah says, is it not a contradiction in terms? That is definitely a position taken by a number of scholars. Somebody says that it's not going to work, a bit like calling a place democratic when it's not democratic. Other thoughts? Welding Christianity together with the identity of a nation. Yeah, that's a very common definition. Eric says an individual convert to Christianity may appropriately claim to their family that this will actually make them a better family member. Similarly, a better citizen of a nation. It can be the hijacking of a Christian faith for exclusive and often xenophobic purposes. Yeah. Noam says, project that aims for Christian values enshrined in the laws and governance of a nation state, a political aim. See, that's a different definition there, you see. Shouldn't any Christian want their government to have laws that reflect Christian values? Let me share my screen again. We can carry on looking in the chat, and we can carry on this conversation in the chat. But I want to go back and give you a few of the definitions of Christian nationalism that I have encountered in the literature. So the most common definition of Christian nationalism that one finds is being given by Whitehead and Perry, their book Taking America Back for God. They say a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life, or with the civic life of whatever country you're talking about. I gave a definition a couple of years ago in an article I wrote on Seen and Unseen that says it's an ideology that seeks political power in order to merge Christian identity with national identity. In other words, it means Christians seeking to impose Christian values on all citizens of a nation by the force of law. I'm not even sure I completely agree with that anymore. My thinking is continuing to evolve on this question. There are a few more softer definitions of Christianity, though. Here's a less soft one. Michael Gorman says the syncretistic beliefs and their corollary practices, i.e. the mixing of select secular national convictions and commitments with select Christian convictions and commitments that involve attribution of sacred and even ultimate status to secular power as the source of divine blessing from the Christian God. Michael Gorman is a New Testament scholar. He believes that it's a contradiction in terms, as one of you said, that it's an oxymoron. You can't possibly be a true Christian and a Christian nationalist, because Christianity means abdicating from any sort of nationalist sentiments. But there's also softer definitions. So Stephen Wolfe, The Case for Christian Nationalism, says it just means a totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. That sounds a bit better, doesn't it? Or here's John Stackhouse, a very vigorous and active scholar in Canada. Loving one's national neighbours in the name of the God who gave us to each other. Just as we properly seek the good of our families in ways or to degrees we do not seek the good of any other, so it follows that we seek the good of our city or of our nation as our priority. These are the communities God has immediately given us to serve. So there's a few more comments in the chat. You write, somebody says, to me, Christian nationalism is a political or socioeconomic ideological concept rather than Christian theological formulation. Sheila says, what Christianity will define the nation, especially in regions where there are different national churches. Absolutely. There's different conceptions of Christianity. Which one is going to rise up and seize power and impose that conception of Christianity on everybody else? And the thing is, if we disagree, this is the point I'm trying to make. If we disagree with some of the policies emerging from Western nations right now in the name of Christianity, would we do the same thing, in the sense, if we took power, would we impose our own version of Christianity and a different Christian immigration policy on that nation, just the same way that they're imposing their version? We may think that, for example, a truly Christian nation would be more welcoming of immigrants. But would we just impose that and implement that if we ended up getting our policies in government? What do we have here? Oh, it's 10 minutes remaining. Yes, sorry. Thank you, Tyler. Do you want me to wrap up and then leave it to broader Q&A, or shall we carry on with the discussion as we're having it, Tyler?
Definitely some time for people to chip in and ask some more questions, but you can continue to guide that if you wish.
Okay, I'm going to make some quick final points, and then I'll open it up to general Q&A. My point is that whatever immigration policy we want to advocate for, whether it's a very restrictive one or whether it's a very open and welcoming one or whatever, if we think that that is legitimated by appeal to Christian values and the Bible, the question that confronts us is, if we are given political power, is it legitimate for us to impose that immigration policy on our nation? Is that a Christian way of doing things? And if we end up saying it's not, is it meaningful to talk about a Christian immigration policy at all? The idea of a Christian immigration policy, you can't have an immigration policy without a national territory. You have to have borders, you have to have control of those borders. And if Christians can't take control of borders and impose a particular immigration policy without falling foul of some of the problems in Christian nationalism, then can there be such a thing as a Christian immigration policy? Now, just a couple of final points. The term Christian nationalism is not formally defined by anybody. So if you're going to use the term, you have to be clear what you mean by it. But it is more often used as a slur to define what people are against than what people are for. That is to say, at least in America, people who are more likely to be identified as Christian nationalists haven't actually heard of the term. It's more often used by people on the left to describe what they are against. It's more often a derogatory term, so be careful when you're using it. But here's the questions for you, and this is how I'm going to conclude with questions, because I want us to have a little bit more time to discuss. Can a Christian immigration policy exist without a Christian nation? Does a Christian immigration policy imply some form of Christian nationalism? Can a nation's immigration policy be more or less Christian? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So let's just open it up for the final 10 minutes now.